They laughed when Captain Riley Thompson walked toward the Apache helicopter, saying women weren't built for combat flying. But when 500 soldiers were trapped behind enemy lines in the largest military disaster in decades, she was about to prove that the most dangerous pilot in the sky doesn't need to be a man. Meet Captain Riley Thompson. 31 years old, steel blue eyes that could cut through fog, short auburn hair that never seemed out of place even after 12-hour flights, and hands that could make an Apache helicopter dance through missile fire like a deadly ballet. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed 135 pounds, and could outfly pilots twice her size with half the ego. But none of that mattered to the men at Fort Liberty Army Base in North Carolina. To them, she was still just the woman pilot, a curiosity, an experiment, a political correctness checkbox that the Pentagon had forced on real warriors. They'd never say it to her face, but Riley heard the whispered conversations, saw the eye rolls when she entered the pilot's briefing room, felt the skepticism. Every time she climbed into an aircraft worth $35 million, today was different. Today, everything she'd trained for, everything she'd endured, every doubt she'd faced was about to be tested in the most catastrophic way possible. The emergency klaxon began wailing at 0547 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a knife. Riley was already awake, going through her morning routine in the small quarters she kept meticulously organized. Coffee, weather reports, equipment checks, the same ritual she'd followed for 8 years of military service. All pilots to the briefing room immediately. This is not a drill. The voice over the intercom carried an urgency that made Riley's stomach tighten. She'd heard that tone before during her deployment in Syria, when everything went sideways in 30 seconds. She grabbed her flight suit and ran. The briefing room was chaos. 12 pilots crowded around a large tactical display showing satellite imagery that made everyone's blood run cold. Colonel Marcus Hayes, the squadron commander, looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Listen up," Hayes barked. At approximately 0430 hours, where Bravo Battalion was conducting a routine patrol near the contested zone when they walked into the largest enemy ambush we've seen in 5 years. 500 soldiers, an entire battalion, are pinned down in a valley with no ground-based extraction possible. The room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of helicopters spinning up on the flight line. "The enemy has moved surface-to-air missiles into the surrounding hills," Hayes continued, pointing to the display. "We've lost 2 Chinook helicopters and a Black Hawk in the past 90 minutes trying to get our people out. The weather is deteriorating rapidly. We've got incoming storm systems that will make flying impossible within the next 4 hours. Captain Jake Morrison, the squadron's most experienced pilot, raised his hand. "Sir, with respect, this sounds like a job for Air Force bombers, not helicopters. We can't get close enough to extract anyone with those SAMs active. The bombers can't help," Hayes replied grimly. "Our people are too close to civilian populations. One wrong bomb and we create an international incident. It has to be precision. Extraction, and it has to be now." Riley studied the tactical display while the other pilots discussed approach vectors and weapons loadouts. The valley was a death trap. Narrow approach corridors, high terrain on all sides, multiple SAM sites, with overlapping coverage. Any helicopter going in would be flying through a gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and concentrated machine gun fire. The terrain rose sharply on 3 sides, creating natural choke points that would force any aircraft into predictable flight paths. The enemy had chosen their ambush location perfectly, and now they had the tactical advantage of high ground, superior numbers, and advanced weaponry. "Who's taking the mission?" asked Captain Tony Rodriguez, though his tone suggested he already knew no one wanted to volunteer for what looked like a suicide run. The question hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Everyone in that room knew the statistics. Extraction missions under heavy fire had a survival rate that dropped exponentially with each passing minute. This wasn't just dangerous. It was a mathematical certainty of death. Hayes looked around the room. "I need volunteers. I won't order anyone to fly this mission. The odds of survival are minimal." His eyes moved from pilot to pilot, searching for someone brave enough or perhaps foolish enough to accept what amounted to a death sentence. These were trained combat aviators, men who had faced enemy fire countless times, who had nerves of steel and reflexes honed by years of experience. Yet none of them moved. Silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Riley could hear her heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of every conversation she'd overheard about women not belonging in combat aviation, every joke about female pilots being too emotional for high-stress situations. She thought about the 500 soldiers trapped in that valley, men and women who had families waiting for them, who had joined the military to serve their country and were now facing death because no one was willing to risk their own life to save them. She thought about every person who had ever told her she wasn't strong enough, wasn't tough enough, wasn't man enough to be a combat pilot. "I'll take it," Riley said quietly. Every head in the room turned toward her. The silence became deafening. She could see the mixture of emotions on their faces: surprise, disbelief, skepticism, and something that might have been respect, though it was quickly masked by doubt. Captain Morrison actually laughed. "Come on, Riley, this isn't a training exercise. This is 500 lives we're talking about." His laugh echoed in the briefing room, a sound that carried years of dismissiveness and condescension. It was the laugh of a man who had never taken her seriously, who had never believed a woman could do what he did. "I'm aware of that, Riley," replied, her voice steady as granite. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show anger or frustration. She had learned long ago that emotion would be used against her, that any sign of what they called female volatility would be proof that she didn't belong. So she kept her voice level, her expression calm, her posture confident but not aggressive. "Look, sweetheart," said Captain Brad Collins, a pilot who'd never missed an opportunity to remind Riley that she didn't belong. "This requires someone who can handle the pressure, who won't freeze up when the missiles start flying. Maybe you should stick to transport missions." The word sweetheart dripped with condescension. Collins had been one of her most vocal critics since the day she arrived at Fort Liberty. He'd made jokes about her in the mess hall, questioned her abilities in front of junior officers, and done everything possible to undermine her credibility. Riley felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but she'd learned long ago to channel that energy into focus rather than fury. "My flight records speak for themselves. I've logged more combat hours than anyone in this room except Colonel Hayes." It was a simple statement of fact. She had the documentation to prove it, had spent years building a record that should have silenced her critics, though it never seemed to be enough. "Combat hours, flying supplies, and personnel," Morrison interjected. "This is different. This is life or death decision-making under the most extreme pressure imaginable." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression making it clear he thought she was in over her head. To him, she was still just playing pilot, still just a diversity hire who had never faced real combat. Colonel Hayes held up his hand for silence. "Thompson, you understand the risks? This isn't just dangerous. It's likely a one-way mission. The math doesn't work in our favor." Hayes had always been fair with her, never discriminating based on gender. But he also wasn't going to send anyone on a suicide mission without making absolutely sure they understood what they were volunteering for. His voice carried the weight of command and the burden of responsibility. Every pilot in this room was under his care, and he took that responsibility seriously. Riley stepped closer to the tactical display, studying the terrain with the intensity of a surgeon examining an X-ray. "Sir, I see 3 possible approach vectors. The northern route takes us through the heaviest SAM coverage but offers the best extraction points. The southern approach is longer but might avoid some of the missile sites. The eastern corridor is suicide, too narrow, too many choke points." As she spoke, she traced the routes with her finger on the display, her mind already calculating speeds, fuel consumption, and exposure times. Hayes nodded approvingly. "If we use a modified nap-of-the-earth approach, staying below 50 feet until the final approach, we might be able to avoid radar lock until we're committed to the extraction zone." The Apache's countermeasures package should give us a fighting chance against shoulder-fired missiles. He was testing her, seeing if she had really thought this through or if she was just acting on emotion. "And when you get to the LZ?" asked Morrison. "How exactly do you plan to extract 500 soldiers with one helicopter?" It was a legitimate question, one that went to the heart of whether this mission was even possible. The skepticism in his voice made it clear he thought she hadn't thought it through, that she was volunteering out of pride rather than tactical reasoning. Riley had been thinking about that exact problem since the moment Hayes had described the situation: multiple trips, fast insertions and extractions. Land, load as many as possible, get out, repeat. The Apache can carry 8 fully equipped soldiers if we strip non-essential gear. She knew it sounded impossible, knew the numbers didn't add up in any conventional sense. But conventional thinking wasn't going to save those soldiers. "That's over 60 trips," Collins calculated, his voice rising with incredulity. "The enemy isn't going to let you make 60 trips into their killing zone. They'll learn your pattern after the first 2 or 3 runs and adjust their fire accordingly. You'll be a sitting duck." He shook his head as if dealing with a child who didn't understand basic mathematics. "Then I guess I'd better fly fast," Riley said simply. There was no bravado in her voice, no false confidence, just a simple statement of intent. She would fly faster than they expected, vary her approach vectors, use every trick and skill she had learned over 8 years of combat. Flying. It might not be enough, but it was their only chance. The room erupted in arguments. Half the pilots thought she was insane. The other half thought she was both insane and unqualified. Voices overlapped, some expressing concern for her safety, others questioning whether they should allow a female pilot to undertake such a dangerous mission, as if her death would somehow be worse than a male pilot's death. But Riley wasn't listening to the debate anymore. She was studying the mission parameters, calculating fuel consumption, plotting waypoints, and preparing mentally for what might be the last flight of her life. She visualized each approach, each extraction, each evasive maneuver she might need to survive. Colonel Hayes called for quiet. "Thompson, I appreciate your courage, but Captain Morrison is right. This mission requires our most experienced pilot." It wasn't said with dismissiveness, but with genuine concern. Hayes had seen too many good pilots die on missions that should have been survivable. He didn't want to add Riley's name to that list. "With respect, sir," Riley said, "experience means nothing if the experienced pilots won't take the mission." She let that statement hang in the air, a direct challenge to every pilot in the room. They could have all the flight hours in the world, all the combat experience imaginable, but if they weren't willing to use it when it mattered most, what good was it? Morrison's face reddened. "I never said I wouldn't." His voice carried defensiveness, the tone of a man whose courage had been questioned in front of his peers. "Then volunteer," Riley cut him off. "Right now." "Say you'll fly this mission?" She turned to face him directly, her steel blue eyes locked on his. This wasn't about gender anymore. This was about who was willing to put their life on the line when it mattered most. Morrison opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence that followed said everything. He looked down at the tactical display, at the satellite imagery showing the death trap that awaited whoever took this mission, and whatever words he had been about to say died in his throat. He couldn't do it. He couldn't volunteer, couldn't commit to what he knew would likely be his death. Hayes looked around the room one more time. Anyone else volunteering? No hands went up. No voices spoke. The room full of combat pilots, men who'd flown through enemy fire and lived to tell about it, men who wore their medals and commendations with pride, sat in silence while a woman half their size volunteered for a mission they all considered impossible. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, though no one acknowledged it directly. "Thompson," Hayes said finally, "you're authorized for immediate departure. Take Apache 77 Alpha. It's got the newest countermeasures package and maximum ammunition load. Your call sign for this mission will be Guardian Angel." The call sign was appropriate, almost poetic. She would either be the guardian angel who saved 500 lives, or she would become an angel herself. Just another name on the memorial wall. Riley nodded and headed for the door. Behind her, she heard Morrison mutter to Collins, "She be dead in 20 minutes. Then we'll have to send a real pilot to clean up the mess." The words were meant to be quiet, but in the silence of the briefing room, they carried clearly. It was the final insult, the last dismissal, the ultimate expression of the contempt he felt for her and every woman who dared to enter what he considered a man's profession. Riley paused at the doorway without turning around. "Captain Morrison, when I bring those 500 soldiers home, I expect a public apology for every doubt you've expressed about female pilots. Will that be acceptable?" Her voice carried through the room, calm and confident, without a trace of anger or vindictiveness. She was simply stating what would happen, as if it were already a foregone conclusion. Morrison scoffed. "Sweetheart, if you somehow pull this off, I'll personally recommend you for the Medal of Honor." It was said sarcastically, with the absolute certainty that she would fail, that this was the last time they would see her alive. "I'll hold you to that," Riley said and walked out. She didn't slam the door, didn't make any dramatic gestures. She simply left, her mind already focused on the mission ahead. Behind her, the briefing room remained silent. Some of the pilots felt shame, though they wouldn't admit it. Others felt vindicated, convinced they would soon be proven right about women not belonging in combat aviation. Colonel Hayes simply felt tired, wondering if he had just sent a good pilot to her death. The flight line was controlled chaos. Ground crews were prepping Apache 77 Alpha with the urgency of a NASCAR pit stop. Weapons specialists loaded rockets and ammunition. Fuel technicians topped off the tanks. Mechanics performed last-minute checks on the engines and flight systems. Everyone knew what this mission meant, knew that the pilot climbing into this aircraft might not be coming back. Riley went through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, but her mind was already in the target zone, visualizing approach angles and extraction patterns. She touched each control surface, checked each system, verified each weapon. This helicopter was about to become an extension of her body, and she needed to know it was perfect. Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos, Riley's usual co-pilot, appeared at her elbow. "Ma'am, respectfully, I'd like to fly this mission with you." Santos was in full flight gear, her helmet under her arm, her expression determined. She had obviously been preparing while Riley was in the briefing room, had made the decision to volunteer without being asked. Riley looked at her. Santos was young, maybe 25, with the kind of steady nerves that made excellent aircrew. But this wasn't a training mission. "Maria, you've got a baby at home. This is likely a one-way trip." Riley had met Santos's daughter, a beautiful 6-month-old with her mother's dark eyes. The thought of that child growing up without a mother made Riley's heart ache. "Those 500 soldiers have families too," Santos replied. "And if we're going to make multiple extraction runs, you'll need someone handling communications, navigation, and weapon systems. You can't do it alone." It was a practical argument, one that Riley couldn't refute. An Apache helicopter was designed for a 2-person crew for a reason. One pilot couldn't effectively manage all the systems while also flying combat maneuvers. Riley nodded. Having Santos along would definitely improve their chances marginally. "All right. Let's get strapped in." They climbed into the Apache, Riley in the front seat where the pilot sat. Santos in the raised rear seat where the co-pilot and gunner operated the weapon systems. They began the startup sequence, each movement practiced and precise. The twin turboshaft engines wound up with a scream that could be heard for miles, a sound that had become synonymous with American military power. Riley felt the familiar vibration through her body as the helicopter came alive, the collective and cyclic controls responding to her touch. This machine was an extension of her will, a tool that responded to her thoughts as much as her hands. "Guardian. Angel, tower control, you are cleared for immediate departure. Weather window is closing fast. You've got maybe 3 hours before the storm makes flying impossible." The tower controller's voice carried urgency. The approaching storm system was massive, with waves that would ground every aircraft on the base. If Riley didn't complete this mission before the storm hit, those 500 soldiers would be on their own. Tower, Guardian Angel, understood, beginning departure sequence. Riley's voice was calm and professional, giving no indication of the adrenaline coursing through her veins or the fear that she was carefully compartmentalizing. Fear was useful if controlled, deadly if allowed to take over. She lifted the Apache off the tarmac and immediately dropped to 50 feet above ground level. This would be a nap-of-the-earth flight all the way to the target zone, staying low enough to avoid radar detection but high enough to clear obstacles. The helicopter skimmed over the ground, weaving between trees and over hills, maintaining a speed that would get them to the target zone as quickly as possible while minimizing their radar signature dot as they flew toward the contested zone. Santos monitored radio traffic from the trapped battalion. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were massing for what appeared to be a final assault. Ammunition was running low. The wounded were mounting. Morale was breaking. If those 500 soldiers weren't extracted soon, there might not be anyone left to rescue. Guardian Angel? "This is Bravo 6, came a voice over the radio. The transmission was weak and filled with static indication of enemy jamming efforts. "We're running low on ammunition and have approximately 40 wounded who need immediate medical attention. Enemy forces are preparing for another assault. Please advise on extraction timeline." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, the battalion commander. Riley could hear the strain in his voice, the barely controlled desperation of a man watching his soldiers die and knowing there was nothing he could do to save them.